Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth week of our class. So, this week's readings explore a narrative many of you are familiar with, the American Revolutionary War. So, to get back to what I love about Lepore so much. So, for decades, we've had conflict between historians looking to give voice to those who have traditionally been ignored in our history books, and that there's often backlash, worrying that giving voice to subaltern, forgotten people somehow undermines the greatness of American history. And like I mentioned, the very first week of class, we saw this just this last year with the conflicts between the 1619 project and the 1776 project. What I love about Lepore is that she celebrates the accomplishments of America, giving us a very traditional sounding political history narrative, while not ignoring the horrible suffering and oppression that made that all possible. She gives voice to as many people as possible and does it so well. When I read how seamlessly, for instance, she incorporated both George Washington and his slave Harry Washington into the exact same narrative, I was absolutely sold on this book. They are part of the same story. You can't have one without the other. African American history, immigrant history, Native American history, women's history, LGBT history, and the histories of anyone who has been oppressed or forgotten are not separate stories. Of course, they can be written as such, but they should be part of the main story. They are who we are as Americans. And I think Lepore has done a wonderful job giving justice to that narrative. So let me switch slides here. Yep. All right. So when I do any kind of history, I really find it useful to incorporate tangents, especially comparisons to world history between world history and American history, as a way to better contextualize and make sense of anything. So as the American colonists were complaining about excessive taxation, they weren't alone. Russian peasants felt the same way. People all over the world felt the same way. So in the 1700s, rulers around the world were trying to come up with systems to better exploit their people to gain more revenue and more power. This is sometimes called the era of absolutism. Catherine the Great of Russia was no different. And like many, she endured serious challenges to her rule. One of the most famous revolts against her was by those following the Cossack Emelian Pugachev. And if you look at the years of the revolt, um, you can see. Oops, sorry, I need to. Okay, sorry, I had to run upstairs. So if you look at the years of the revolt, you can see that it was happening at the exact same time that the American Revolution was beginning to brew. So one of the reasons I include Pugachev's revolt is to point out that this is one of the last revolts in world history that doesn't somehow incorporate the language of liberalism and rights, as would be developed further through the about to happen American and later French revolutions. So Pugachev was a Cossack, and Cossacks had previously been free to do whatever they wanted, provided they would be Russia's cavalry in time of war. Historically, this has not been a very successful way to have soldiers, as Cossacks, like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, had no qualms about switching sides to the Poles when it suited him better. So Catherine the Great, was worried about the Cossacks, and in an effort to rein them in, she tried to get them to pay taxes and become serfs. Pugachev revolted not as much by saying, "You're violating our rights," like the Americans were doing at this same time, but by telling people that he was Catherine the Great's dead husband, returned from a monastery to claim his rightful throne from his naughty wife. Very few people believed him, but without a language of rights, Russians in the Cossack region, so this is near the Volga River, resorted to a language of royal intrigue and fantasy. So he reigned in the Volga region for 2 years, then was betrayed by spies. In total, about 20,000 people died in the Pugachev revolt, and most participants were spared harsh punishment by saying some variant of, "Gee, I'm glad Catherine's back in control. I only followed Pugachev because I thought he was Tsar Peter III, returned from the dead. I really only want to do what's best for Mother Russia, blah, blah, blah." So Pugachev is a medieval style of revolt, perhaps the last one in world history. So let's get into modern times. So the Pugachev revolt, oops, was similar early on to revolts in the British North American colonies. In 1772, the same year Pugachev rose up, for example, there was an incident where the crew of a British ship trying to prevent smuggling went ashore in Rhode Island and stole some sheep. Hungry sailors used to do that kind of stuff, and farmers, sheep farmers in particular, didn't like it. So in this case, the Rhode Islanders chased them back to their ship, burned the ship, and killed the captain. The Crown wanted to try the perpetrators. This is the HMS Gaspee. They wanted to try the perpetrators in London, but New Englanders were offended that the Crown didn't trust their own legal system. Samuel Adams, in campaigning for a trial in New England and for the independence of colonial judges more broadly, created what he called a committee of correspondence, basically a complaint service where people could write in about their gripes. Every successful revolution in history has had something similar, a way for people to share their complaints, and therefore recognize that the revolutionaries are the ones who can solve their gripes. So the French, a decade later, for example, would call theirs cahiers de doléances, complaint boxes, basically. So thus, by the time of the Boston Tea Party in 1773, there was an established infrastructure for disobeying the crown. Pugachev didn't have this kind of bureaucratic structure when he revolted in Russia at the same time. Most of the people he worked with, himself included, were illiterate. So I want to shift gears to a different kind of rebel now. And I love that Lepore is counting this as part of the main story. So one of my favorite little subplots that Lepore weaves into this story is that of Benjamin Lay, an amazing person. I made the point last week that people resisted slavery from the very beginning, but by the mid 18th century in America, slavery was very much commonplace. It was an evil that, if not necessarily seen by all people, was still part of people's everyday lives. The products they consumed, the profits they earned, and the surpluses that built the bustling cities across colonial America were all products of slave labor. It had become so ingrained that to really protest against it, one had to reject the entire society built on slavery. And Benjamin Lay did just that by living in a cave, growing his own food, so he could know that his life in no way benefited from slavery. And he had the chutzpah to decry not only slavery, but many other forms of oppression as well. And I loved Laporte's detail that Benjamin Franklin had a portrait of Lay up in his house, and we can surmise that Lay very well might have been the one who changed Benjamin Franklin's attitude towards slavery. So, so far I've been discussing the juxtaposition of liberal ideas in both economics and politics to slavery, and the power of slavery over Atlantic world governments. There's more. The 18th century was one of ridiculous wars. Over and over again, there were wars fought for rival dynastic claims, over wanting to maintain balances of power, and importantly, over wanting to maintain monopolistic control over commodities coming out of the Americas. As the 18th century progressed, Americans did more and more of their own fighting at the behest of their colonial masters in Britain. The French and Indian War is one that actually started in America. It was called the Seven Years' War outside of America, but it wasn't just fought there, it was a global war, pitting rival colonial powers and their allies against each other all over the world. In the end, Great Britain was wildly victorious, laying claim to virtually all of French possessions in North America. The problem was that the British wanted the Americans to pay their own fair share of taxes. They, after all, had just gained an empire for themselves while putting the government into debt. The Americans, who had raised and provisioned their own armies, felt like they didn't owe Parliament anything. So, we're trying to switch slides. So you saw this slide last week. Even though Americans were only paying a fraction of what the British were paying, they were able to mobilize their complaints against taxation quite effectively. So, as the Sugar Act, was painted as a giveaway to the planters of the Caribbean, as the Stamp Act was considered completely unjust, the Americans had a way to actually fight against this. Okay, so the 1770s then. So the 1770s have several important turning points that, historians at the time, those writing it at the time, uh, argued led to outright rebellion by the middle of the decade. So first in 1770, there was the Boston Massacre, when a riot against the oppressive nature of a military occupation was met with force, and 5 people died. The only reason this was relevant was because Bostonians made it so, living in perhaps the most literate part of the world at that time, with an enormous grassroots publishing industry desperate for new posts to keep people buying their papers. They successfully named ordinary riot control for the period a massacre, and people bristling at an oppressive amount of everyday, what we today might call police brutality, they were outraged by this massacre. So then there was the Boston Tea Party, where people protesting the dumping of East India Company tea on the American colonists, even though it was being sold at below market value, uh, were angry at another corporate giveaway and decided to attack company property. It was wild while it happened, but the consequences were pretty extreme. After the tea was thrown in the harbor, Parliament passed what the media of New England quickly labeled as the Intolerable Acts, basically closing Boston Harbor by naval force until Bostonians paid for the tea they had destroyed. Down in Virginia, members of the Assembly voiced solidarity with Boston, so in retaliation, the king dissolved their assembly. So you now had a bunch of unemployed politicians in Virginia who, in order to find another job, formed a Continental Congress in September as a way to unify policies towards Britain across the English speaking North American colonies, the 13 colonies, not including the Caribbean, as you read about last week and the week before. So in January of the next year, the British Prime Minister offered to let Americans be in control of their own taxation again, the salutary neglect of previous decades where the Americans kind of just did their own thing. Uh, but you now had an institutionalized system of rebellion in place, so it didn't work. Similarly, hotheads in Britain had rejected the olive branch petition of the new Congress, hoping to mend ties, which came after the first battles of the war had already happened. So in April 1775, royal troops attempted to seize a weapons cache in Lexington, near Boston. The Americans fought back there and at Concord and killed hundreds of troops through guerrilla tactics. They then fought a few weeks later at Bunker Hill, losing but killing almost 1,000 British troops in their retreat. What Lepore does so well in this narrative. Oops. Okay, I'll just show this. Let me switch to this slide. Sorry. Okay. So what Lepore does so well in her narrative is to give equal weight to another type of rebellion, that of slaves rebelling for an end to their condition. One thing the royal governor of Virginia did in November 1775 was to raise a regiment of freed slaves, naming them after the classic fascination at the time with Ethiopia among Philo-Africanists of his day. 300 men volunteered. It's called the Ethiopian Regiment. So by the end of the war, thousands fled to British lines, and 5,000 former slaves settled in the British colony of Nova Scotia, which is now a Canadian province. And many too went on to have lives in Great Britain, as well as eventually the colony of Sierra Leone. Harry Washington, as you read, was a rebel political leader in Sierra Leone. So I've included some details along with a picture of a preserved uniform piece in this slide. So that summer, then the Continental Army coordinated with colonial militias to take on serious actions against the British. The Battle of Ticonderoga in May gave the Americans heavy artillery, and while many thought that their actions were extreme for just a tax dispute, the next year gave many Americans ideological reasons to rebel by planting the rebellion firmly within the transnational liberal ideologies that were burgeoning in this period. So I put this picture in last year while teaching this class in a physical classroom to kind of shock my students a bit, but mainly to make the point that the ideas that transformed the American Revolution into a serious movement for liberalism were so well articulated that they have been built upon by virtually every constitution in the world, including the North Korean one. So, not all governments follow those constitutions. But the American Declaration of Independence, which started as an explanation, so that the American Declaration of Independence has ideas that have been incorporated into constitutions around the world, and the American Constitution, which came later, is also important. So, the American Declaration of Independence, which started as an explanation to the king, has become one of the foundational documents in global liberalism. The truths we hold to be self evident, which I love that is the title of Lepore's book, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are at the core of the theory of natural rights and the foundation for liberalism in the modern era. Before this document came out, Thomas Paine's Common Sense convinced many Americans to join what became called the Patriot Cause by many, again using the latest liberal ideologies of the age to call for a people's God given right to govern themselves. And I hope the irony of these sentiments in a place where slavery was so prevalent isn't lost on you. As you'll see in so many of your readings for this week, it wasn't lost on Americans in that period either, at least not on the ones opposed to slavery. So, with this slide, I also just want to mention that, ideas alone weren't enough. The Continental Army was horribly underfunded for most of the war. The Continental Congress was rarely able to muster the willpower it needed to keep funding the fight. Without French, as well as Spanish and Dutch assistance, Native American assistance, perhaps the colonists would have won their fight against Britain. But when the defeat at Yorktown finally happened in 1781, it caused excitement around the world. Here was a new country founded in an anti colonial rebellion based on the latest ideas of liberalism. Liberals and Enlightenment thinkers around the world were hopefully optimistic that the American experiment just might work. I think we're just as hopeful 240 years later, though perhaps a tiny bit more confident in ourselves. Think histories of the American Revolution that you're all, of course, familiar with. This hopefully builds on Lepore's reading for this week. Remember, I want to see your paper proposals, and I wish you luck writing. As always, try your hand at these bonus questions, and enjoy week 5.